Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we go after shame any way we can, whether it's through religion, sex, culture, whatever it is, we go after it. That's our deal here. And I'm super excited to have Sara Rands with me today. She is actually one of my newest providers at Symmetry Counseling. So super excited to have her as one of our associate therapists. And she was telling me that one of the things that she's done, especially through her studies, was a capstone on figuring out some of the research around faith transitions. And she's taken a really cool interest in how existential therapy, like that theoretical model, can be helpful for those going through faith transitions. So I'm like, well, that sounds really interesting. And I want to learn all about what you learned. But instead of just telling me about it, why don't we tell the world about it?
Sounds like a plan.
That's what we're doing here today.
Yes.
But before we get started on that, I'd love to just, give a little bit of your background, give a little bit of your own history. How do you come into this field of becoming a therapist yourself? Let's start there.
Sure. So I went to BYU back in the day, and I've always had a lot of wide-ranging interests. But back when I was a young adult, one of those interests was psychology. I wanted to be a therapist, but kind of went the stay-at-home mom route instead for reasons I think a lot of us understand. And I think there were some confidence issues too. So I did that. And then once my kids were in school, got a transcribing job. One of those classes I transcribed was a coding class. And I thought, this seems interesting. So jumped into that. That was kind of a fun a brain challenge, and address some financial issues too. That got a CS degree at UVU, and that went into a 6-year programming career. But as time went on, that just became like less of a good fit for my talents and passions. And so tested out counseling, and then jumped into a clinical mental health counseling degree with Northwestern University that I finished in March.
Okay. That's awesome. Yeah, congratulations. It's a big deal.
Thanks.
To go back to school and kind of change years, second half of life, all the good things. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, well, and as much as you're comfortable, why don't you share with us a little bit about kind of your own story and why you might be interested in faith transitions, right? And what you chose to study.
Sure. So I grew up at LDS in Southern California and went to BYU, where I had a bit of a faith crisis when I was like 19, 20, and an existential crisis. I had a philosophy class that led to a lot of questions. And I resolved that at the time, like by praying and getting what felt like an answer from God. And that led me to be deeply committed Mormon for the next 20 years. Raised my kids in Utah County. Was very happy with my little world. And that worked for me until it didn't, I had some experiences where it was like I had less confidence in my own personal revelation because it conflicted with the bishop's revelation. And that still don't lead me to question it. So like a couple of years later, and there were a lot of other things that kind of, church history, feminist issues, some of the logic training I was getting in my CS program kind of led me to question more and more things until I didn't believe I still loved it though. I still attended until like my body wouldn't let me anymore. I was getting headaches and stomach aches going to church, and I learned later, hey, maybe that's a trauma response. So let's learn about some of that.
Mhm.
Also, part of my story is I got cancer at age 32 with 3 little kids, and so that kind of ties into some of my existential interests as well.
Mm.
Kind of having to maybe confront mortality at a little bit younger age and kind of decide how you want to live life.
Mhm.
As a result of my faith transition, we had a mixed faith marriage for a couple of years. Tried so hard to make it work, and ultimately didn't. Had an amicable divorce, and that's led to remarriage and a blended family. And we still have Sunday dinners together, though. We were able to kind of get along in that kind of, and still kind of feel like family.
Oh, that's really lovely. I'm always impressed when families can do that. So that's really beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yes,
Yeah.
that's a lot. Maybe a little bit later on, I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about existential therapy as what
Sure.
is. But I had asked you to come up with like 5 talking points, and I don't know if this is one of them or not, but I thought maybe we could start with statistics, because I know that for your capstone project, you did talk a lot about, that people are leaving organized religion, and that's something we often talk about on this podcast as well, that this is kind of a growing trend. So,
Right.
yeah, what do you have to say about that?
Sure. So that's Pew Research has kind of talked about how more and more people are leaving religion, especially younger people are less tied to religion than they used to be, and there are a lot of us that were in religion and leave. So the Pew Research talks about the religious nuns, NONES, but there's also more research to where they talk about the duns, which are those that were in religion and then left. So the people that are done with religion, and kind of these people come at it from a little bit different point of view, and like here in Utah, I think most of us like see that like all around us. It's kind of hard to miss around here. Whereas and my colleagues at Northwestern, they were very curious and interested in hearing the stories because they didn't see it around them quite as much.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting that it was through reading a little bit of what you had written that I realized, yeah, that's right. There are the people who just never really quite get motivated by religion, don't really get that
right.
religion, even from an early age. And but then there's those of us who were very involved in religion, and then for whatever reasons left, and that I would imagine would be quite a different experience.
Right. Yeah.
Your side of this. All right. Well, so let's get started with kind of, what is kind of the first thing that you got prepared for us to share?
Sure. So, and we care about this from a mental health perspective because I think, as a lot of us know, this is a big deal, right? At least for those of us that were like really in it, right? I've talked to some people where like, oh yeah, I was raised Catholic and I stopped believing. My family was like, no big deal, right? That's not who I'm talking about. For those of us in like more high demand systems, there's big consequences to, like your relationships, your sense of like morality and what worldview and meaning and what the afterlife looks like. All of this is like put at risk when your beliefs change. And that, of course, leads to lots of mental health issues, as I think a lot of us around here see most days, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Well, it's a huge part of our practice, right? At Symmetry. It's not the only thing we do at Symmetry Counseling.
Sure.
By all means, we definitely work with a lot of people going through faith transition. So is your talking point number one then that those who are leaving high demand religious systems are going to experience more consequences to their mental health? Is that your point?
That it's not a small thing, right? It affects a lot of areas of life, and I think it depends on people's personalities, right? There's some people that might be able to roll with the punches a little better for whatever reason, but for people that like really believed it or really liked the certainty of having the answers, or have more of their systems at stake, more of their relationships, it it has wide-ranging effects on people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say like a faith transition is a bit of an identity makeover, and maybe not a bit at all, an entire identity makeover. About a religious framework. Everything is seen through that framework, right?
Exactly.
So what's my purpose in life? What should I do with my life? How should I conduct myself? What should I believe about other people?
Right.
How should I make sense of the problems that come up in my life? How should I make sense of the good things that happen in my life? Right? I mean, it's like
exactly. Exactly. I know when I went through it, it felt like there's a sense of falling down a rabbit hole, right? Of not really knowing what ground was, what to believe. Like we have all these shortcuts to make decisions, and not feeling like I could trust those shortcuts, and needing to like overthink or think through everything like from the beginning before I could like make any moves. So it felt a little paralyzing there for a year or so.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
And this is what you found in the research then?
Right.
Lived experience.
Yeah, this kind of sense of, like we talk about in like the Truman Show, right? Or the Matrix, kind of this sense of, I thought the world was this one way. I kind of had this bubble, but then things kind of pierce this bubble, and like I don't know what to believe is true anymore. And that's like a really destabilizing experience.
Right. Well, and I think a lot of our listeners may have already heard this term, but there's was it a Franciscan priest back in the day that called it the dark night of the soul, right?
Yes.
And that's, I think, pretty apropos that everything that you felt made sense in life, how to make sense of life, is now being questioned and doubted. Okay. Yeah. And that does it's not just existential in the sense of like, oh, I just have these thoughts. I think to your point, when we say, okay, this affects your mental health, this can lead to depression. It can lead to clinical anxiety disorders. It can lead to PTSD. It can lead to adjustment disorders. It can lead to a lot of relational distress, like you talked about, which, faith marriages, which then of course can lead to all those things as well. So it is something to be taken really seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. All right. So moving on then to talking point number 2.
Yeah. So the research I looked at, there were probably about a dozen or so studies that like would interview people long forms, this what they call grounded theory, where they ask people, hey, tell me your story for like an hour, and they look at what themes come up, and then they kind of code those themes. So they say, okay, these are the themes that come up, so they can kind of in a objective kind of a way see what arises organically out of people's stories. And you kind of saw different themes and kind of stages almost that people went through, reasons, what kind of triggered the faith crisis, and then kind of what people had to go through to get to the other side in a healthy kind of a way. And so we kind of saw that it tends to start with cognitive dissonance. There's some kind of conflict between what you were taught and some new knowledge or values that you're getting. So a lot of times, like in the Mormon story, we tend to hear, I thought this certain thing about church history, and then I learned new things about church history or polygamy, or sometimes there's conflict in values, right? Like I know I was taught that being gay was sinful, but I know my brother's a really good guy and he's gay, and how do I resolve that? And our mind really wants to like get rid of that conflict. We don't like sitting with that, and sometimes we'll change our beliefs, but if it just gets too much, or sometimes we'll change like our perception to match our pre-existing beliefs, because that's like easier. But when the conflict is too great, we have to change our beliefs, and that tends to be what triggers people.
Okay.
Is that kind of what you see in your work as well?
No, absolutely. And I want to clarify too. So when you're saying that sometimes people will deal with cognitive dissonance by changing their perceptions, that you're stating like they'll figure out a way to make it work.
Right.
Which examples of that for me could be like, I mean, I remember when hearing about polygamy, which this has been disproven historically as well. But I used to remember thinking, well, there were, men died and there was a lot of these women who needed help. So even though I didn't like the idea of polygamy, I somehow explained it into my belief systems. I didn't change my belief systems by saying, oh, well, it must have been this thing. Or when people would bring up Book of Mormon like issues with evidence, I'd be like, well, maybe Joseph Smith didn't understand that the word he was translating was which is called mental gymnastics, right?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, you get this uncomfortable information and then you're like, ooh, that doesn't really fit with the story I thought it was, so I'll just come up with an explanation of why it doesn't, but I'm not changing the story.
Right. And we can do that like so far, right? Which is why like the ex-Mormons have the analogy of a shelf breaking, right? You can maybe do that for like a few books on that shelf, but if you keep piling up different issues, it tends to break. And that tends to be how faith transitions happen. People tend to not leave for just one reason. They tend to leave for like half a dozen reasons.
Right. And that it eventually just there's like a pendulum swing. You can't stay in that space anymore.
Right.
Just I'll mention comments as I get them from people listening. Perfect. So Amanda Rogers Stradling says, one thing I've noticed is that I'm a little more stressed out about my problems because I don't have the same belief that everything will be fine as long as I follow the commandments. I think she's referring to when we were talking about mental health issues.
Yeah, anxiety.
And now I have to actually confront my problems and look for solutions. It can be unsettling, but it's also empowering. So she's seeing like a silver lining to this as well. So
no, definitely. And I think we see that in kind of the faith transition story. Where, so when the shelf break moment or series of moments, people have a lot to go through, right? There's a lot of negative emotions people have to confront if they want to move through this. It feels, so there's like, anger for sure comes up, and that can be alienating from, believing friends and family. There's this feeling of betrayal, and these are like big emotions that like people try to like keep contained, but kind of tend to leak out over their family. There's fear of rejection, fear of being judged, lots of regrets about what would my life have been had I like known this before. They have to confront a lot of losses, and their relationships are at risk.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, it was interesting for you to mention your brother who's gay. I mean, that's like a lived experience, right? So
that's not mine, but just a kind of a typical story I would hear. Right.
Yeah, that's a story I hear all the time too. So it's like sometimes you have historical things that don't make sense, and like the story that was offered doesn't make sense, but then sometimes it's more of a lived experience that isn't making sense.
Right.
So
I know that's kind of how that's how it was for me personally, right? If it was historical, I could say, oh, that's fine, but once it kind of, for me, it intersected with my own family history in kind of an interesting way that's too long of a story to get into here. But it wasn't until it got personal that I started to have it hit at a personal level.
Yeah. Well, and that's a point I'd like to make, is that even if it is just historical, for a lot of people, it isn't until the history becomes personal to them, where they've lied to or betrayed or something like that. So it can be historical that makes it personal for somebody.
Absolutely.
But at some level, it has to become personal.
Right.
It's not usually going to happen if it's not personal, right? And
I agree.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so talking point number 2 is that you're saying that the research shows that for most folks, it starts with cognitive dissonance.
Right.
And then their desires to integrate, to become more integrated, not to have these competing values.
Yeah, right. Our minds really don't handle that very well.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Talking point number 3 then.
Okay, so the process people tend to go through, there are these negative emotions I was mentioning. People go through an identity crisis. There's kind of this sense of like, for those of us that are out of adolescence, kind of having to go back there to resolve, to look at our identity again from a lens of like not having an institution tell me what to do. What do I organically think about myself? And if people like meet those, like go through this journey, this kind of dark night of the soul, and they like meet these things with courage, and especially if they have social support, if they have boundaries from their religious life, they can come to the other side of a thriving place where they feel this freedom and increased growth and new opportunities after they've mourned all the stuff they had to mourn, or they can really get to this other side of this like greater life in our remaining in the time we have left here.
Okay, so your talking point number 3 is really the process of it.
Right.
I definitely want to like dive into a few of these more in depth. So
yeah.
Emotions, and even mentioned this kind of in the last point, is not just emotions, but fears, right?
Yes, yes.
Fears of how am I going to be perceived? Who's going to judge me? Am I going to be able to stay in relationship with people I love? And then all the normal feels that come with this, like, well, one of the feels is fear, but also fear, betrayal, guilt, confusion, shame. Like, why is this happening to me? Why am I having to experience this? Even maybe a feeling of kind of like the Groundhog Day, like I want to go back.
Right. Worry, you know, I know I was worried, like what's going to happen to my kids. There are anxieties about that sort of thing. So lots of feelings. And I usually kind of make a point in a lot of my religious trauma or faith transition groups to talk about how we're not super feelings literate when we come to others. That is so true.
Right? So you may be experiencing a lot of feelings and either not knowing how to name them all or what to do about them.
Right. Well, and in our tradition, there's like a sense of like negative emotions are from Satan, and that anger or contention is of the devil, and it's kind of some of these fear things about that might lead us to where I think from a broader mental health perspective, you know, some going through negative emotions is kind of needed for a full emotional experience, for being able to, you know, experience joy and to have the closeness that we need in relationships.
Yeah, for sure. I also want to touch on this kind of going back to adolescent development, which I think a lot of times can be seen as like this silly thing or this immature thing or this like, oh, you're just acting like a teenager, you know, and it's
or midlife crisis, or for those of us in midlife going through those.
Right. Which, yeah, it's a whole nother thing, because I think that's things actually, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
When you look at like, I don't know, purist Ericksonian developmental stages, you know, this whole idea was like, if you haven't been able to go through a stage, you're going to have to go back and revisit that stage, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter how old you are. So there is adolescent stages, but then midlife developmental adult stages also mimic adolescent stages. So you may be doing both,
right?
Actually, which are actually very healthy. But because I think we say adolescent, a lot of times there's this like perception that you're being, you know, immature or silly. And no, that's like necessary work. So I thought I'm taking this off of a slide I came up with for my religious trauma group, but like, what is the adolescent developmental cycle entail? And that's a time when, and we're talking about like maybe 13 through 19, right? So, and even emerging adulthood. So that kind of decade, this is the time to explore your identity. This is the time to learn independence. This is a time to build your own resilience. It's a time where you're supposed to get much better at abstract thinking And it's also time for metacognition, which means like now we can have thoughts about our thoughts, whereas when you're littler, you're not as able to do that. So when you think about that compared to how most of us who come from high demand or high control religions are treated in that same decade, and this came to mind very apropos because there was this meeting that I actually attended where my kid was going to as a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
They're like 16. They weren't like a little 12-year-old. They were like 16. And the bishop came in and had this kind of like meeting, fireside, whatever. And he basically said, you are Mormon. We were still using the term Mormon back then.
Mm-hmm.
So, you are Mormon. And this is what it means to be a Mormon. This is what you believe. This is what you think. And these are the positions that you'll have, including anti-LGBTQ positions. He was very clear about that. And so my kid came out of there fuming, my 17-year-old kid, I forget how old they were, came out there fuming, saying, how dare somebody tell me what I must think, right? And so you can see that their adolescent developmental stage and what the bishop was trying to teach was completely at odds.
Absolutely.
Which is why I think, to your point, there's a lot of nuns, right? Because like when they're 16, 17, they're like, I'm out, peace out. I'm not going to be in a place where you just tell me how to live my life and what I'm supposed to think and all that.
Right. And then there's others of us that like get comfort from that, right? I'm thinking about like Fiddler on the Roof, right? The song about tradition where we have this strong, like, we will tell you who you are. And like people sometimes get comfort from that. Or I think there's types of personalities that are more or less comfortable with uncertainty. And the faith transition journey is like embracing that uncertainty. And that's thrilling, more thrilling and less fearful for some folks than others.
Right. Yeah. So you will have to go back and do some adolescent stages. And if you are in midlife, the midlife developmental stages are all about rethinking what your values are. Most of us, like once you're hit 45 to 55, which is kind of what's considered midlife, is our kids are more independent. Now, granted, there's people who are having kids later these days, but I think most of us, especially in Latter-day Saint culture, started having babies pretty early on, and so your kids are now teenagers. They're more independent. You're starting to face mortality. You're starting to realize, boy, I only have like 20 maybe good years left. Before I start into my aging years and even might die. And what do I want to do in my life? What are my values? And so that's actually a very normal part of development. Yeah. And so, this belittling this process isn't good for us, right? Yeah. It's a needed part of getting to that thriving stage, of getting to the other side. We have to kind of face all this scary stuff in order to get there. It feels a little like a hero's journey to me, right? Where we kind of have this call to adventure and it's scary and we get some guidance and get to a better place. Or like a grief process, right? This thing that I thought was true about the world turns out not to be true about the world. And how do I have to go through feelings about that? And what are the opportunities on the other side after I go through those feelings? Yeah. Yeah, so you ended your talking point by saying, okay, the research shows that it sucks pretty bad at first.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody's having a lot of feelings. Everybody's having an identity crisis. You have to revisit a lot of stages and get through a lot of development, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And most people do come out saying, I actually benefited from this experience. I'm actually glad I went through this experience. This is actually helpful and beautiful part of my life. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, no, that's what I'm seeing. Is that what you see? Or
John DeLynn and I, for those of you who are aware of Mormon stories, we did this whole thing with his wife Margie DeLynn called "The Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis," right? And that was his language to basically say, okay, yes, we're here, we get it, it's hard, we're in the midst of all the dark, dreary, like dark night of the soul stuff, but there is this beauty at the end of it. And we need to know that. People who are going through this need to know that, because I think one of the things that happens from the religious side is that what are the people on that end telling you? It's like, well, of course you're having all these problems. Of course you're having all these horrible feelings. Of course your life is falling apart and you're disoriented and confused because you have lost the light, right? Quote unquote, you've lost your testimony, you've lost spirit, all this language that gets used in different cultures. It basically says your experience is not valid. What you're doing is not valid. You need to get back on the boat.
Right. And you can just choose to believe and then it'll be fine. And one thing, the interesting thing that came out of the research is that this process of losing belief, or deconversion, as they call it, isn't experienced as a choice. We don't, we can choose how to respond to it, but like the actual things we believe was more a thing people realized and not a thing they decided.
Yeah. And I'm really glad you brought that up because I think that's true of belief as well. I think a lot of times people do think that they have a choice. Well, I choose to read my scriptures and I choose to pay my tithing, or I choose to go to church, and that's why I have my beliefs. But really, beliefs are not usually chosen. They come, like I couldn't change my belief back to believing in Santa Claus once I understood that concept, no matter how much I would have wanted to. And believe me, at age 9, I definitely wanted to.
Right. No, we, for me, I the way I thought about it at the time was I felt like I could have chosen like to think about it or not. Right. I could have chosen just to like segment that part of my mind and not go there, but that didn't feel like a healthy choice. And that wasn't part of my religion where I believed this was true. And so it was safe to think about all this stuff. And I think there would have been downstream mental health effects for like, having a big scary part of your mind you're not allowed to go, right?
Yes, that you are right. When we compartmentalize, compartmentalizing can be okay for a minute or a while, and sometimes it can be actually healthy for mental health. like when we say, well, let's try to put that into its own place and not be thinking about it and ruminating about it all the time. At the same time, when you have big thoughts or ideas and you're not allowed to express or to think about them, especially because other people are upset if you do.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, now this is not helping your mental health. This is actually secretive and duplicitous within yourself. And that causes all kinds of distress. And we know this, especially and sadly, through the LGBTQ community for living in closets, the toll that takes on their mental health because they're petrified to come out and be authentic, right? And authentic seems to be healthy, authentic we can be, it seems like the more healthy we can be. So
absolutely,
those things are definitely correlated. I'm glad you brought that up about the not the choice. Okay. Talking point number 4 then.
Yeah, existential therapy.
Yeah.
So I'm in my second quarter of graduate school and taking my theories class, and we have a chapter about existential therapy, and I'm like, what is this? And I read about it and I think the ex-Mormons need this. Why aren't we talking about this? Because so much of that faith transition journey ties into some of these existential things where we kind of have to like rewrite what a good life is for ourselves. So what is existential therapy?
Let's start there.
Yeah. So it's like an outgrowth out of existential philosophy. And there's some authors, like especially Urban Yalom, who wrote a textbook about this in like 1980. And the basic idea is that there's scary things about being a human. There's what they call the 4 ultimate concerns that, first is death. We're not going to be here forever. Second is freedom. Like we don't know, like what we have choices, it seems like, but we don't know what the right way to go. Our choices affect other people. When we choose one thing, or when we commit to a thing, we're committing also to not do the other things. And all this leads to lots of anxiety. existential isolation, which is the sense that like nobody else is in your skin and can fully know what it's like to be you, and sometimes connecting with other people can be fraught. And meaning and meaninglessness, right? There's not like an evident one single meaning that all of us agree on why we're here, and that makes it hard to know what we're doing here and to like feel good about what we're doing here. And these four things are part of the human condition, but and lead to a lot of anxiety, especially when we, like we were just talking about, when we try to avoid it, when we like push it out of our minds. But when we confront these things and can kind of get used to them, it can be painful, but ultimately healing. It can lead us to like lead a better life when we like have thought about these things and confront it.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, everything you just mentioned are things that I think most religions try to give an answer to, right? So
right. I think that's why we have religions.
Why, what happens after death, and why does death occur? And, you know, how are you supposed to make your choices and use your agency, right? Which is kind of this idea of freedom. And how are you supposed to conduct yourself as an individual? and I think it also like takes away a lot of individualism, because we must all be the same and somehow, you know, so religion like puts us all on the same playing field instead of really acknowledging the true individualism. And then of course, tons of meaning of life, right? I mean, I remember the 1980s little video that our church came out, which is like, why are you here? It's like, it was all these questions. Why are you here? What is life? You know, and it's like,
where are we going?
Because we have all the answers to all of that. And
right. That's a big selling point.
Yeah. And I will say that when I was a more traditional believer, that brought me a lot of comfort, thinking that I had the answers to all of that. It has definitely been painful as I've become a much more abstract believer or thinker, or you know, however I guess I would identify myself now, right? Which is with a lot of ambiguity.
No, and this is why religions are powerful. They really speak to something in our soul and kind of protect us from these big, scary existential concerns. And I think that's what leads to a lot of the mental health benefits that we see for people with connected to religion and spirituality, is they kind of are, they protect us from worrying too much about some of these things. About death, we don't have to worry about that so much because there's an afterlife. And so if you aren't like fully living now, that you can do that later, right? Or you know, you don't have to worry about freedom because we have these commandments that tell you exactly what you should do. And isolation, right? There's this sense of like God or the Holy Ghost is like this companion that can like know you, so you like aren't alone. And but then also these religions can build strong communities, so you like feel less alone just socially between, you know, being in a close-knit community, or, you know, when early marriage and parenthood works well, that can help people feel less alone. And then like this strong, you know, meaning of life, right? Like you're talking about with the commercial, right? Then if you want to know the meaning of life, the LDS missionaries can tell you like in about an hour, right? With these cool charts. And it can lead to this real sense of comfort when you're in. But the problem is that when people have that shelf-breaking moment, they're suddenly unprepared, and they like go from like this warm blanket of protection to like being to not having that, to being exposed to all these scary anxiety producing ideas like all at once.
Yeah, and it is scary. And so it sounds like you're saying through existential therapy, a therapist would be able and willing to understand what these kind of four kind of themes are, and then bring them in to the therapeutic process to be able to discuss now new potential ideas around these topics.
Yes. Yeah. So like, not all of us are like really comfortable with these topics, even some therapists. And it's not so much a specific kind of therapy as a lens that you kind of look at the world through. And you still like use can use tools from different other theoretical aspects. But it's a helpful lens, especially after the faith transition experience. I think, confronting our mortality, and the research bears out that existential therapy is seen to be helpful in like cancer survivors, because they're having to confront that mortality in kind of a structured way is not really the word for it. But I know for me, like going through the cancer treatment one time, wasn't it? You had to keep, there continue to be scares, throughout time, and having to confront that in a way that ultimately I think I got comfortable with it, right? That, okay, this really could happen. And like, instead of it being this scary, anxiety inducing thing, it led me to, make the brave, scary choices where I feel like I'm confidently, courageously living today. So if, God forbid something bad did happen, I would have fewer regrets, right? And I think that's kind of how this existential therapy can lead to better mental health outcomes, is by kind of an exposure therapy, I guess, for some of these anxiety-inducing ideas.
Well, and it's so interesting as I've landed in the work that we are doing. I realize as therapists, we have not really been trained to talk about sex, about religion, about death.
Right. No, these are,
I think, what everybody's talking about in our circles anyway.
Right. And as therapists we aren't, and then like out in the world too, right? These are kind of taboo subjects. I think sometimes talking about death is more taboo than sex, right? This isn't a thing you can just like sit with your girlfriends and talk about, or at least maybe not till like some of the older life stages.
Yeah,
it's kind of, well, we saw that in the Barbie movie, right? Barbie says, have you ever thought about dying? And like the party stops, right? This is not,
right.
we can't like go to our social networks reliably and get help with this, because that requires that the person you're talking to has gone there, and that's a scary place, and not, I don't think it's easy to get there before you're ready, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think death in particular, like, I mean, all of these 4 topics are interesting, but death in particular, even as practicing members of the church, we were not really encouraged to talk about it. It was almost like this, like, well, aren't you glad you don't have to worry about it?
Exactly. We wear colors at a funeral because we're happy because we're going to see them later, right?
And a lot of people have complained to me over the years, both believers and non-believers, that they felt like they weren't given permission to grieve and to rage and to be angry, even at God, if that's their belief system, is when something really tragic happens. And so you're just expected to be like, well, but we have it all figured out, and you don't have to have all these difficult feelings. So even though it's protective, like you said, in some ways,
right,
other ways it protects you so much. It's like overly, like these helicopter parents that are over.
Yes.
They're not really allowing for the expression that needs to happen in order to move forward in healthier ways. Mm-hmm.
Right. I know for me, after going through the faith transition, there were new things I had to mourn. And I said, this is probably a common experience where people might have to face the, people that have died, and they have to re-mourn it from a different perspective of life being more permanent. I know for me, I had breast cancer, and so there were surgeries I had, and, missing body parts. And I kind of had to mourn that all over again because, I'm probably not getting my breast back in the next life, right? I don't think so. Anyway, there were these, new things to mourn. And that was, that was a thing I had to go through.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I hadn't thought of it that way, for sure. Okay. So then you're saying talking point number 4 is existential therapy. The research is one helpful approach. that can also be used within other theoretical models as well. Like you can do existential therapy with CBT or with IFS
Right.
or with, all different family systems, approaches, is helpful for people going through faith transitions. And that gets us to talking point number 5.
I hope someday I can do existential group therapy, right? I think getting a conversation going among people that this speaks to them, right? And I think that's not everybody going through a faith transition. I think some of us, maybe because we have better structures in our lives or more like clear meaning, or might struggle with these ideas less. But for those of us that are struggling, I think it would be helpful to like have a conversation with each other and see what helps other people. Existential crises are lonely, and knowing that other people are going through it, and that other like big thinkers have like thought through this stuff, makes you feel less alone. Just knowing that other people have gone through this, have like looked into the void and come out on the other side with a healthier life, I think can provide deep comfort for people struggling with existential anxiety.
Okay, so you're really kind of talking now to the communal piece, like don't do isolation. Like this is actually, we do better when we find others who are going through this, which is, I mean, the research on group therapy and support groups is phenomenal, right? Like
right.
A lot of cases you actually see more benefit from doing a group type of approach than an individualized approach anyway.
Right.
So, and I think there's a lot for that, right? Not being in isolation, not feeling like you're alone, not feeling like you're the only one who's going through this.
Absolutely.
Hearing other people's ideas on how they've improved or helped, yeah.
And this is the research that we do have about existential therapy is when we've tested it, it's been in the context of the existential group therapy, mostly with cancer patients. But for the reasons we've talked about, I think it would be helpful for those of us, having to reinvent our lives after a faith transition.
Yeah, I love that. Well, that's all great. I'm going to pick on one of the slides that you sent me over. I know that those of you who are listening aren't seeing slides necessarily, but you had a slide called Thriving. And so towards the end of our 5 talking points, I wanted you to go through what you saw in the research as to how and why many people do reach a point where they would call themselves thriving versus struggling, or deconstructing versus reconstructing, right? So
the research is kind of new about this. So most of the research was just kind of describing the process, and one of them did talk about like what helped people like remake their identity, and what led to getting to a thriving place. One was having social support, was very helpful. One was like dealing with religious trauma, either through therapy or through things like journaling. And the other piece, let me see if I can remember it here, was having boundaries from your previous religious life. So kind of not kind of being able to confidently express those boundaries of not letting that fear of judgment and rejection pressure you into being inauthentic.
Okay, right. Which is complicated because a lot of times when we're saying boundaries from the prior community, that's your family. That's your
exactly.
That's your mom. That's your auntie, right? That's your grandma. That's your neighbor,
right? Or spouse or children. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And again, many of them are well-meaning and are still functioning in that belief system, and so usually their intent or their desire or their hope is to get you back, right? That would be a very normal desires, to have you come back to the fold, come back to the
exactly,
come back to the community. come back to the covenants, right? Well, whatever language people use. And so that can be very difficult for somebody who is trying to path a new way forward.
Right. Especially those of us that are more on the people pleasing end of things or conflict averse, or which I think is a lot of us from high demand religious spaces.
Right. And that can feel like I'm doing something mean or I'm doing something harmful to the relationship.
Right. Kind of this sense of it can be normal, I think you've said before, to kind of have these enmeshed boundaries and like getting to a space where we can kind of be more assertive with those boundaries. It can be a difficult place to get to.
Yeah.
But healthy.
Yeah, super interesting that those were the three things that were mentioned. As far as the slide that I'm thinking of, that I'm going to just share a few thoughts that we put on here. So, and I think these are things that must have been in the research that people either did or got to. So like it was like a phase of personal development. So if you can think of this as like, okay, I'm going through a phase of personal development. That could be a really nice reframe.
Right. Okay. I see where you are.
Dark night of the soul or whatever.
Yes.
Some of the research also talked about self-discovery, which is, I think, goes along with personal development really well. I get to discover myself in totally different ways, kind of like I get to decide what I believe. I get to decide what I want to do. I get to decide what my gender role is going to mean for me, right? And that's going to look like, or my sexual orientation. So tons of freedom to self-discover now, instead of like when I was referring to my kids' meeting where the bishop was like, no, this is how you're going to think.
Right.
Too. And so changes in values, right? So we actually have to decide what we're going to value. And instead of like, oh, I have to think these things matter, now I get to decide what values I will have. There was an increased confidence, empowerment, freedom, and relief. Those are like pretty big words.
Yes.
That's a lot. I mean, that's 4 big words, you know.
These were from about five different studies where they kind of, where people ended up, kind of how they described that thriving place. Not so much how people got there, but kind of describing it, just this freedom and authenticity and relief, right? Not feeling like they had to like make things fit together that didn't fit together, and confidence, right? I think the stuff that comes out of like facing these identity pieces and working inside and coming to a place that's more authentic and brave. Yeah.
And goal, you said 2022, so that's a fairly recent study by Goal.
Right. This is all very recent.
Yeah. They spoke about transformed sense of self. Like, that's huge. And you know, when I look at myself through everything I've been through and my relationship with my religion, which I still have tons of love and respect for my religious community, even though I went through a lot of crapola through it.
You did.
I truly have seen a transformation of who I am as a therapist, as an individual, as a mother, partner. You know, like every aspect of my life has been touched by this.
Right. And when I look at it from like my cancer survivor perspective, like what a tragedy to like have that in you and like not express it while you're here, right? There's just something beautiful about like showing authentically who you are and giving that to the world, and just a tragedy to have that be hidden.
Absolutely. Well, Sara Rands, is there anything else that you're wanting to make sure you get across that I haven't asked you about?
That's what I have to share today, right? I'm curious if there's other people out there where this like resonates with you, and maybe I'm the only one, right? But if you are out there, I'd love to talk to you to see if these ideas speak to you.
I highly doubt you're the only one.
Indeed, maybe the research said it wasn't.
Doubtful. And you will be presenting on this at the Mormon Mental Health Association's
That's correct.
Conference that's coming up August 1st and 2nd, I believe. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. And that's in conjunction with Sunstone, I believe.
So that's a conference that offers CEs for therapists, and you can attend online or you can attend in person here in Salt Lake City, Utah. So if you're a professional who works with faith transitions or who works with LDS/Mormon clientele, that's a great conference to be aware of. That's very specific, and we try to address these issues that we constantly say we didn't get enough training on.
Yes.
On how to work with these kinds of concerns. But I don't know if you're like, are you willing to, like, if somebody's interested in your capstone project or anything like that, would you be willing to send it? Like, is there...
Oh, yes, please.
Best way to get in touch with you or share? Yeah, just share a little bit about how people can either work with you or get in touch with you if they want to.
Sure. So I'm working at your practice at Symmetry Counseling. My email, I believe, is srands@simcounseling.com, and I believe the URL is simcounseling.com/Sara-Rands, SARA-RANDS.
Okay. And we'll make sure we put all of that in the show notes and comments so that people can click on things easily. But it is a really interesting presentation with a lot of good references if people are interested in research and things like that, that I think would be awesome. I think there's a lot of people doing research finally on faith.
Right. It's all very recent in the last 5-7 years, which I guess makes sense if this is a growing trend, right? It has to happen and then people can react to it.
Right. So it's exciting when people either are doing the research or can, bringing the research together to make sense of it. So thank you so much for your work on this. And Sarah's great. She's currently taking new clients for anybody who's looking for somebody who'd be a good fit for either religious trauma, faith transitions, as well as other mental health concerns. I know Sarah's great and does take this existential approach, as well as obviously have been trained in other theoretical approaches as well. So thank you so much for your time, Sarah.
Oh, thank you for meeting with me today. This has been so fun.
I really appreciate it. And everybody take care. Have a great rest of your week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nahodishkishe the novel, so we can to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. sleep in our cities. We sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No dish ki shade na ho. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.